Harold Beckett pushed open the garage door, and it creaked, as it always did, with that lazy tiredness that reminded him of his own joints in the morning when he got up to make coffee for the two of them. It had been a long day, a consultation at a new restaurant on the outskirts of Seattle, where the chef, a young guy with tattoos all over his neck, had argued with him about the proper way to marinate salmon, and Harold, with his 30 years of experience, had simply nodded because he knew that sometimes it was better to let a person make a mistake so that he could figure it out. He dropped his keys on the rack by the door, shook his raincoat, which smelled of rain and the fresh greens of the restaurant kitchen, from his shoulders, and walked into the house, where the air was warm, with a hint of vanilla from the candle Molly lit in the evenings to make everything cozy, as she said. The kitchen greeted him with the dim light of the island lamp, and there she stood at the sink, Molly, his wife, wearing nothing but her underwear, the simple cotton ones with the thin straps that he had once liked to take off slowly, like unwrapping a present. But now she was pulling on her sneakers, tying the laces with quick, energetic movements, and her ponytail swung as she lifted her head and smiled at him, a smile that always seemed sincere, but today there was something new in it, like the shadow of a cloud on a sunny day. "Hey, Harry, you're early today," she said, straightening up and adjusting the sports bra she'd just thrown on over her underwear, her voice cheerful, like someone who'd just woken up and already had plans for the day, even though it was almost 8 o'clock at night. She always called him Harry when she was in a good mood, shortening his name as if it made them closer, younger, and Harold usually smiled back. But today he just stood there, looking at the table where there were two cups, their favorite, ceramic ones, the glaze cracked from frequent use. They were empty, untouched, and the coffee in the coffee maker wasn't even brewed, even though they'd sat at this table every morning for 6 years now, drinking coffee together, discussing the news, or just being silent, looking out the window at the garden where Molly's roses bloomed even in the rainy Seattle weather. "I thought you were going to be out late with that new boss," she continued, stepping closer and kissing his cheek, her lips cool as if she'd just been drinking water. "He's so stubborn, remember what you said?" Harold nodded, but his eyes were still on the cups, and he felt a tightness in his chest, not painful, but just uncomfortable, like forgetting to turn off the lights in an empty room. "Yeah, he's stubborn, but he's talented," he said, trying to keep his voice level, as intelligent as ever, without unnecessary emotion, because that was what he was, a quiet, slightly shy man who preferred to solve problems at the kitchen table rather than shout about them. "We've sorted out the menu," added a couple of dishes with an Asian accent to appeal to the younger crowd. He took off his glasses, polished them on the hem of his shirt, and set them on the table next to the cups, which seemed to him now to symbolize something broken, like a crack in the foundation of a house that you don't notice until it rains. Molly nodded, her eyes, bright green like the leaves in their garden, sliding over him quickly, and she turned to the refrigerator, getting out a bottle of water. "Sounds great. I closed the deal with that gym downtown today. Remember that trainer, Logan? He was so persistent, but we signed in the end. I was tired as a dog, but I decided to go for a run to warm up." Her words flowed easily, as always, charismatically, with the same energy that had once attracted him, an old chef, to this young realtor, full of life and ambition. But Harold couldn't stop thinking about the coffee for 6 years. Every morning, it was their ritual, like a prayer before a meal, and today it had been broken, and he didn't know why, but he sensed it was more than just forgetfulness. "Molly, what about the coffee?" he asked quietly, gesturing to the cups, his voice wavering just a little like an old engine idling. "We always have it together in the morning. Is something the matter?" She paused for a second, bottle in hand, and turned to him, her brows drawing together slightly, but her smile didn't disappear, just grew a little wider, as if she were trying to hide her irritation. "Oh, Harry, I'm sorry, I just overslept today. A client called early, had to run to a showing. It's okay, we'll make it tomorrow, okay? Or do you want it now? I can wait for the run." Her tone was caring, but there was a sense of urgency in it, like someone who was already mentally out on the street, on the move, and Harold felt a pang, not jealousy, no, but rather self-doubt, that she still needed him as much as before. He shook his head, sitting down at the table and pouring himself some water from the carafe. No, go run. I'm tired from the journey. Maybe I'll watch the news. Molly came over and hugged him from behind, her hands sliding over his shoulders, and he felt the warmth of her body, but it did not kindle anything in him except sadness. Are you all right? You look thoughtful. Is it the job? She asked, and her voice was soft, sincere, because she was not angry, just selfish sometimes, self-centered, like many young women in her profession, where every day was a struggle for commission and smiles from clients. Harold turned, looked up at her, and said, Yeah, the job. And age, I guess. Things change after 50, Molly. Your body is not what it used to be. He was trying to joke, but it came out sad, and she laughed, ruffling his hair. Hey, you're still my handsome boss. Don't be sad. I'll be back in an hour, and we'll have dinner together. Maybe we can order pizza. With that, she kissed him on the top of the head and walked out, the door slamming, and the house suddenly became empty, like those cups on the table. Harold sat for a long time, looking out the window where the rain was beginning to drizzle, and thought about how everything had changed in the years. When they had met, he had been 50, she was 28, and she had seemed like a breath of fresh air to him in the routine of his life since his divorce from his first wife. She had loved his stories about restaurants, his calm, and he had loved her energy, her laughter that filled the house. But now, at 56, he felt his body failing him, not suddenly, but gradually, like food that loses its flavor from sitting for too long. Impotence had come on unnoticed, first as a few misfires, then as a constant shadow, and he had not spoken to her about it directly, ashamed, because in American society men over 50 were expected to be strong, successful, and not complain about such things. He stood up, put the cups in the dishwasher, and went upstairs to the bedroom, where the bed was neatly made. As always, Molly liked order. It was one of the things he liked about her. Night fell softly on the house, with the rain rustling outside, and Harold lay in bed, listening to Molly come back from her run, shower, and then slide under the covers next to him, her skin fresh and smelling of lavender body wash. She turned toward him, put her hand on his chest, and whispered, Harry, are you asleep? He wasn't, but he pretended to be for a second, then opened his eyes and smiled weakly. No, I was waiting for you. How was your run? He asked, his voice rough with exhaustion. She moved closer, her foot brushing his, and she said, Good, it's refreshing. You know, sometimes running is like therapy. All your thoughts fly away. Harold nodded, and in that moment he felt the impulse to put his arms around her, to hold her close, the way they used to be so intimate, so simple and natural. He turned, his hand sliding around her waist, and he kissed her neck, but her body didn't respond, as if something inside had broken, and he pulled away abruptly, turning onto his back, looking at the ceiling. Molly propped herself up on one elbow, her eyes glittering inquiringly in the dim light. What's wrong, Harry? You, again? Her voice was quiet, with a note of disappointment but not anger, because she was trying to understand, but frustration was building up like raindrops on a window. Harold sighed, feeling his self-worth slipping through his fingers like sand. Yeah, again. I'm sorry, Molly. I can't. I don't feel like a man around you. It's age, maybe, or stress. I don't know. He was being honest because he trusted her, but deep down he was afraid it would ruin them. This crisis of a relationship where one partner changes and the other stays the same. She rested her head on his shoulder and said, Hey, don't apologize. We'll figure this out. Maybe you should see a therapist. Or maybe we can just chill together, no pressure. But there was weariness in her tone, and Harold thought about trust, how fragile it is when intimacy fades, and how age-related changes force one to rethink oneself, one's role in the family. They lay in silence for a while, and Harold remembered how she had stayed late at work last week, saying that a client, that fitness trainer, Logan, wanted more property viewings, and he hadn't asked because he trusted her. But now, in this silence, doubt crept in like a shadow. Molly, is this Logan? Is he a normal guy? Has he been pestering her or something? He asked suddenly, surprising himself with his candor. She laughed softly. Harry, he's a client, a fitness trainer, all muscle and diet. We just closed the deal. Are you jealous? Her words were light, but there was a note of irritation in them, as if he were invading her space. No, I'm just curious. You talk about him a lot lately. He replied, using the English word as they sometimes did in conversation, mixing languages because they were both Americans, raised in a culture where casual conversation was full of slang. She turned, kissed him on the cheek. You're my only one. Go to sleep. But Harold lay awake long, thinking about self-worth, how a man in his 50s could feel complete when his body was betraying him, and the forgiveness he might have to ask not only of her but of himself. He rose early that morning, made coffee, put 2 cups on the table, but when Molly came down, she grabbed hers as she went, saying, I'm late for a meeting, Harry. I'll have a drink in the car. And she walked away, leaving him with a full cup that was cooling slowly, like their relationship. Harold's day went on as usual, driving to another restaurant, consulting on the menu, but his thoughts kept returning to home, to that night. When he returned that evening, he decided to talk to someone not Molly, but a professional. He dialed Dr. Grayson Mattox, a therapist recommended by a friend, and made an appointment. What's troubling you, Mr. Beckett? The doctor asked on the phone, his voice ironic, with that all-American directness. Relationships, doctor. An age, Harold answered curtly. Ah, classic. Come on over and figure it out, Mattox said, and Harold felt a sense of relief, as if the first step toward personal growth had been taken. When Molly returned that evening, they were eating dinner in the living room. He had cooked seafood pasta, her favorite, and they were sitting at a low table, watching the television, which was playing the economic news. You know, Harry, Logan called today, thanked us for the deal. Said he'd invite us to the opening of his new restaurant, she said, twirling her pasta around her fork. Harold nodded, but something tugged at him inside the social dilemmas of mixing work and personal life, and the moral questions of boundaries. Cool, maybe we should, he said, but his voice was flat, unenthusiastic. They talked about work, about plans for the weekend, maybe a trip to the mountains to unwind, and Molly perked up. Yeah, let's do it. I need to get out of the city, get some fresh air. But that night, when she fell asleep, Harold lay thinking about his family responsibilities. Being a husband meant not only providing, but also being emotionally close, and he felt like he was failing. The next day, after his session with Dr. Mattox, Harold sat in a cafe near the therapist's office, sipping a latte and reflecting on the conversation. The doctor, a middle-aged man with graying temples and an ironic smile, said, Harold, impotence after 50 is not the end of the world. It's a sign that it's time to sort things out. How do you feel about your wife? Harold answered honestly. I love her, but I'm afraid she'll leave. She's young and energetic. Mattox chuckled. And you? Are you still the chef who won her heart? Or are you hiding behind your age? The dialogue was lively, like a conversation with a friend, and Harold felt the themes of relationship crisis and personal growth come to life. I'm not hiding, doctor. I just can't physically, he said. Then start with trust. Talk to her openly, Mattox advised. When Harold got home, he found Molly in the garden, watering roses, wearing shorts and a tank top, looking so alive he wanted to hug her. Molly, let's talk, he said, coming over. She turned, wiping her hands on a cloth. About what, Harry? You seem serious. They sat on a bench, and he told them about the session, about his fears. I'm afraid I'll lose you because of this. You deserve more. Her eyes grew wet, and she took his hand. Harry, I'm not with you for sex. But yes, it's hard for me. I feel lonely sometimes. The dialogue flowed naturally, like a river, and they discussed trust, how it is built on honesty, and the changes of age that affect them both. The morning in the urologist's office smelled of antiseptic and freshly brewed coffee from the machine in the hallway, reminding Harold of the days when he would make his own espresso in a restaurant, catching the rhythm of the morning while the waiters set the tables. Now he sat in a hard-backed chair across from Dr. Kenneth Walsh, a man in his 60s with a neat beard and the manner of speaking as if he were explaining something to a student. There was a poster of the genitourinary anatomy on the wall, and Harold tried not to look at it because it made his problem seem too real. too medical. He tugged at the hem of his shirt, feeling out of place, as if he were taking an exam he hadn't studied for. "So, Mr. Beckett," Dr. Walsh began, looking at the computer screen that probably displayed the results of the tests Harold had taken last week, "your numbers are normal. Testosterone is low, but nothing out of the ordinary. Prostate is fine, no signs of inflammation or anything more serious. Physically, you're healthy for your age." He leaned back in his chair, folding his arms over his chest, and looked at Harold with a slight smile. "So it's probably a combination of stress, fatigue, and, well, age. After 50, many men notice changes. Libido drops, erections become, well, less predictable. That's normal." Harold nodded, but the word "fine" cut like a knife through an old wooden board. He had always considered himself a man who could cope with restaurant menus, with the whims of suppliers, with life. But now his body had decided to play by its own rules, and it felt like a betrayal. He cleared his throat and said quietly, almost in a whisper, "Doctor, I don't feel normal. I can't be with my wife. I can't do it at all. It's not just less predictable. It's like he hesitated, choosing his words, like I'm a ghost in my own house. She's there, next to me, but I can't reach her. And she's different." Walsh raised an eyebrow, but didn't interrupt, letting Harold finish. His gaze was professionally neutral, but with a hint of sympathy, like someone who had heard this story dozens of times. Harold continued, feeling the words escaping like a long, pent-up torrent. "Molly is younger than me, 34. She is full of energy, always on the move, always with clients, with these deals of hers. And I sit at a desk, consulting for restaurants, and then I come home and I don't know how to be a man for her. She doesn't complain, but I see the way she looks. Sometimes she looks away when I try to hug her, and I don't know if it's me or if something is changing in her." He paused, feeling his cheeks burn with shame. Talking about such things with a stranger, even a doctor, was like undressing in public. Walsh nodded, wrote something down on his pad, and put his pen down. "Harold, let me be blunt. What you're describing isn't just physical. Age plays a role, yes, but there's also mental health. You're talking about your wife, how she's changed. Tell me more. What exactly is bothering you, besides, say, the bedroom?" Harold thought about it, looking out the window at the gray Seattle rain that was pouring down onto the parking lot where his old Toyota was parked. He remembered Molly coming home late the night before, her hair damp from the rain, saying she'd been to a client meeting Logan again, the fitness trainer who, she said, just wanted to see another commercial property. She'd spoken quickly, enthusiastically, as if she were telling him something important, but her phone was lying face down on the table, which was unusual. She always left it open, like someone with nothing to hide. I don't know how to explain it," he began, fiddling with his fingers. "She's always been bright, charismatic. It's one of the reasons I fell in love. But now her energy seems to be focused elsewhere. She talks about work, about clients, about some plans, but she rarely asks how my day is. We used to chat for hours over dinner, but now she goes running, or to meetings, or just sits on her phone, and I think maybe I just can't keep up with her. Maybe I've become boring to her." Walsh nodded, his beard twitching slightly as the corner of his mouth quivered into a smile. "That sounds familiar, Harold. You're not the first person to feel this way. When there's an age gap in a marriage, sometimes it feels like you're living at different speeds. You say you feel like a ghost. Have you tried talking to her about it? Not about sex, but about how you feel in this relationship?" Harold shook his head, his gaze falling to his hands, where his wedding ring gleamed dully in the lamplight. "I tried. Yesterday, in the garden. I said I was afraid of losing her. She said I was important to her, but—" He sighed. There was something in her words, as if she was calming a child. "I don't know, maybe I'm making it up. But I see how she smiles when she talks about her work, about the people she meets. And with me, she's, like, on pause." The doctor leaned back, tapped his fingers on the table, and said, "Okay, let's get this straight. Physiologically, we can try to do something. There are drugs, like Viagra or Cialis, that help in most cases. It's not a panacea, but it can restore your confidence. But Harold, a pill won't solve what's going on in your head or between you and your wife. If you feel like a ghost, it's not just about an erection. It's about connection, about trust. Do you trust Molly? The question hung in the air like the smell of rain outside. Harold hesitated. He wanted to say yes, because it was the right thing to do, because he loved her, but he remembered the moment she put the phone away when the text came in, and how she quickly changed the subject. I want to trust, he said finally, but sometimes I feel like she's not telling me something. It's not that she's lying, but it's like she's keeping me at a distance, and I don't know how to fix it. Walsh nodded, wrote something else down, and said, Okay, here's what I'm suggesting. We can start with a low dose of Viagra to see how your body reacts. But I strongly recommend that you continue to work with a therapist. You mentioned Dr. Mattox. He's a good one. And one more thing, take the time to talk to Molly. Not accusingly, not demandingly, just honestly. Tell her that you feel like a ghost. Sometimes that opens doors you thought were locked. Harold nodded, but the thought of Viagra made him resent it. He didn't want to be the kind of man who relied on pills to feel like a man. It felt like giving in, like he was accepting that his time had passed. He took the prescription Walsh handed him, but he could already picture himself standing in the drugstore, blushing in front of the young cashier, and the thought was unbearable. I'll think about it, doctor, he said, standing up. Thank you for your honesty. You're welcome, Harold, Walsh replied, shaking his hand. And don't blame yourself. You're not a ghost. You're just a person going through changes. That's life. Harold walked out of his office and down the stairs and into the parking lot, where the rain had gotten heavier, pounding the hood of his car. He got behind the wheel but didn't start the engine, just sat there, watching the rain run down the windshield. He remembered how once, about 3 years ago, he and Molly had been stuck in the car in a downpour, driving home from dinner at a restaurant, and how she had laughed when he tried to open the umbrella, only to have it blown out. They had been happy then, wet and laughing, and he had felt alive. Now he felt like the umbrella, broken, unable to protect. He decided not to go home right away. Instead, he stopped at a small cafe on the corner that served decent coffee and croissants, the kind he had once taught the owner, an old friend, to bake. The cafe was almost empty, just a couple of students sitting in the corner, their noses in their laptops. Harold ordered an Americano and sat by the window, looking out onto the street, where people were hiding under umbrellas. He pulled out his phone and texted Molly. How are you? I'll be home by 6. Maybe we can get Thai, she responded almost immediately. Cool, let's do it. I have a meeting until 5, then I'm free. Love you. The message was warm, but Harold couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing, that spark from before. He finished his coffee and drove home, deciding that he would talk to her that evening, as Walsh had suggested. Not about Viagra, but about how he felt, about how he feared becoming invisible to her. Molly was already home, but not in the kitchen, but in the living room, where she was sitting on the couch, scrolling through something on her tablet. She was wearing a light blouse and jeans, her hair was loose, and she looked so young, so alive, that Harold paused for a second in the doorway, feeling like a stranger in their shared space. Hey, Harry, how are you? She looked up, smiling, but her fingers continued to slide across the screen. I'm looking at new properties for a client. This Logan guy keeps asking for something cutting edge. He's got rock star demands. Harold nodded, sitting down next to her, but not too close. I'm a little tired, he said, looking at her tablet, where pictures of glass offices flashed. I saw the doctor today. She put the tablet down, her eyes widening. At the doctor's, is everything okay? You didn't say you made an appointment. Yes, a urologist. About, well, he coughed, feeling his throat tighten. Said it was my age. Offer me Viagra, but I'm not sure I want it. Molly looked at him carefully, her hand resting on his knee. Harry, you don't have to take anything if you don't want to. We can just be together. That's not the point, really. but there was something in her voice that he couldn't quite place either relief or weariness. She squeezed his hand and added, I just want you to be happy. If you need help, I'll support you. Want to see a therapist together? He shook his head. I already go to Mattox. But Molly, he paused, gathering his courage. I sometimes feel like you're not with me, like you're on hiatus when we're together. Is that true? She blinked, her smile faltering. Harry, what are you saying? I'm here with you. It's just a lot of work. You know how it is. I'm not on a break. I'm just busy. He nodded, but something inside him twisted. They ordered Thai food, ate, laughed at some joke from a TV show they had been playing in the background, but all evening Harold couldn't shake the thought that she had responded too quickly, too easily. And when she went to bed and he stayed behind to clear the dishes, he noticed her phone beep again, and a name appeared on the screen, Logan. Harold didn't check. He trusted her. But the word pause stuck in his head like the bitter taste of unfinished coffee. Harold stood at the window of the small home office he had set up in the basement of their Seattle home, where the air was always slightly cool and smelled of the old cookbooks he had collected from his days as a chef downtown, and watched Molly get ready for another home showing, as she called these client visits that had become suspiciously frequent lately, especially in the mornings when the sun was just breaking through the perpetual fog over Lake Washington. She was in the bedroom upstairs, but he could hear her footsteps, light and quick, like someone who was hurrying not just to work, but to something exciting. And when she came down to the kitchen, he noticed it right away, the makeup, not the everyday kind, with a light lip gloss and mascara, but full, with smoky eyes and blush that made her cheeks so pink, as if she had just come back from a run, although runs were not a rarity now but the rule, every morning, even in the rain, when she wore those short shorts, too short for a simple morning workout. It seemed to him now, at 56, when every observation of her turned into a small crack in his calm. Harry, are you up yet? She called from the kitchen, her voice cheerful, with the kind of charisma that always attracted customers, and he heard her pouring herself a smoothie from the blender they'd bought together a year ago to get healthier, she'd said, laughing at his skepticism. I thought you were going to sleep in after last night's dinner with those restaurant guys of yours. Harold came downstairs, trying to walk quietly so as not to show his tension, and found her at the island, wearing those same shorts, tight and sporty, with a bright stripe down the side, and a top that emphasized her figure, and wearing the kind of makeup she'd only ever worn for parties or dates with him when they'd first started dating. Yes, I am, he said, coming closer and pouring himself coffee from the thermos on the table, trying to sound normal, intelligent, without the jealousy that had already begun to squirm inside him like a worm in an apple. You're early today. Another showing. Who's it for this time? She turned, smiled, her lips glistening with lipstick, and said, Oh, a client who wants to look at some commercial real estate in downtown. Nothing special, but the commission is good. And you, consulting today? Harold nodded, but his gaze slid down her legs, down those shorts, and he thought that before she wore them only for the house, for him, and now for the street, for jogging, which had become longer, and she came back from them flushed, with her phone in her hand, checking her messages. They talked for a while about their plans. He mentioned going to a restaurant uptown where they needed to work on the seasonal vegetable menu, and she nodded, finishing her smoothie and setting the glass in the sink. That sounds good, Harry. Maybe you could make some of that tonight. I'll be back by 6 if I'm not late. With that, she kissed him on the cheek, her perfume new, with notes of citrus and vanilla washing over him like a wave, and she was gone, the garage door slamming shut and the house quiet again, like the afterglow of a guest who'd forgotten to say goodbye. Harold stood at the window, watching her car pull out into the street, and felt a pang, not pain, but something deeper, a paranoia that whispered, Why is the makeup just for show? Why are the shorts so short? He knew it was the age-related changes in himself that made him see shadows where there were none, but the relationship crisis was already building up like clouds before a storm, and he couldn't ignore it. Later, in his office, where old cooking magazines lined the shelves and his notebook filled with recipe notes, Harold decided to check not out of jealousy, he told himself, but out of curiosity, because Molly was always sharing her Instagram, where she posted photos of houses for sale with hashtags like #Seattle Real Estate and #DreamHome. He opened the app on his phone and found her profile at Molly Beckett Realtor and began scrolling, noticing how her posts had gotten brighter with selfies in workout clothes with captions like, "Movement starts with movement," #FitLife, and there, under each one, were likes from different people, but one was the same. At Logan Fit Coach, the trainer, Logan she'd mentioned, his profile picture a muscle-bound guy with a toothpaste commercial smile, and he'd liked every photo of her for the past month, even the one of her in those short shorts in front of a park with the caption, "A run is the best way to clear your head." Harold felt his heart pound, and his paranoia took shape. Why him? Why didn't she mention that they followed each other? He clicked on Logan's profile photos in the gym, with clients, posts about motivation, and there, in the stories, was a video of him training a group, and in the comments a heart from Molly, simple, but it cut like a knife. He put the phone down and stood up and paced the office, feeling ashamed of being a teenage peeper, ashamed of his impotence, which left him vulnerable, because if he couldn't be a man in bed, how could he compete with this Logan, 38 years old, all muscle and energy? Jealousy burned inside him like the chili peppers in a sauce he'd once made too hot, and he thought about trust, how it crumbled over little things, likes on social media, and the moral dilemmas of whether he had the right to pry into her life, or was he being paranoid? To unwind, he drove to a park near his house where they sometimes walked on Sundays, but today was a weekday and the park was almost empty, just a couple of dog walkers and joggers, and Harold sat on a bench looking out at the lake, the water rippling in the wind, and remembered how, a couple of nights ago, he had been woken by her whispers. She was sitting in the bathroom, the door ajar, talking quietly into the phone. "Yeah, I'll see you tomorrow." "No, it's okay, he's asleep." He hadn't asked then, putting it down to work, but now it echoed in his head, and he wondered, who was that? A client? Or, back home for lunch, Harold decided not to sit around doing nothing. He began gathering information, unobtrusively, like a chef tasting ingredients before mixing. He called an old friend, Bob, who was a manager at the same restaurant where Harold was consulting, and they met at a small bistro downtown overlooking Pike Place Market, where the air was thick with the smell of fresh fish and flowers. Bob, a stocky guy in his 50s with a mustache and a perpetual smile, sat at a table munching on a salmon sandwich and said, "Harry, you look like you haven't slept in a week. What's wrong? Are those young chefs bothering you again?" Harold ordered a salad, but didn't feel like eating, so he quietly replied, "It's not the chefs, Bob. It's Molly. She's changed. Jogging every morning, wearing makeup to work, even going to bed without pajamas, just in her underwear, like she's waiting for someone. And she whispers into her phone at night." Bob raised an eyebrow, chewing. "Hey man, women change. Maybe she's having a midlife crisis. She's 34. That's when they start thinking about themselves more. Or, maybe someone has come along." Harold felt a prick, but nodded. "I checked her Instagram. That trainer, Logan, likes all her posts, and she likes him. You think I'm paranoid?" Bob shrugged. "Maybe so, but if it's bothering you, talk to her. Or, there are detectives, private detectives. My cousin hired one when his wife was acting weird. Expensive, but the truth comes out." Bob's words stuck in Harold's head like a bone in his throat, and for the first time he thought seriously, should he hire a detective? It seemed like a betrayal, a social dilemma to invade his wife's privacy, but the paranoia grew, mixed with shame at his weakness, at the way age had made him insecure, and a jealousy that whispered, "She deserves better than you." That evening, when Molly returned, they were having dinner on the terrace, grilling vegetables, trying to create an atmosphere, and she sat opposite in a light dress, talking about the day. "That client was so picky today, but he signed in the end. Logan, remember, he wants to expand his fitness center." Harold nodded, but asked, "Why are you running in such short shorts? I've never worn them before." She laughed. "Harry, they're comfortable, and it's gotten hot. Are you jealous of my legs?" He smiled, but inside he was seething, and that night, When she fell asleep without pajamas, her body warm next to him, he lay awake, thinking about personal growth. Maybe this was a chance for him to change, or was this the end? The next day, Harold went to the library, not his home library, but the public one downtown where he sometimes reads psychology books. And there, on the computer, he searched for Seattle private investigators, but closed the tab, feeling ashamed. Instead, he called Dr. Mattox and made an emergency appointment. In the therapist's office, overlooking the street where people hurried under umbrellas, he sat down in a chair and said, "Doctor, I'm going crazy. Molly has changed jogging, makeup, phone at night, and that trainer on her Instagram." Mattox chuckled wryly. "Harold, paranoia is a defense mechanism. You fear loss because you feel inadequate because of your impotence. But think about it. Is this reality or your fears? Hiring a detective is a step into the abyss, a loss of trust." Harold nodded. "But jealousy is eating me up." "What if it's true?" Mattox replied. "Then talk. Family responsibilities include honesty. But first, sort yourself out." That evening, at a family reunion at Molly's sister's in the suburbs, where relatives gathered for a barbecue, Harold watched her chatting with her nephews, laughing, and her phone beeped. She looked at it, smiled, and put it away. He went over. "Who texted?" she said. "Work, a client. Don't worry." But he did, and paranoia grew like a weed in a garden. Harold stood by the living room window, where the late summer Seattle sunlight was filtering through the blinds, casting striped shadows on the hardwood floors they had polished together a couple of years ago, when they had planned to redo the entire house to their taste, full of warmth and memories. But now the shadows seemed to him like a symbol of something torn, like pages from an old book that no one wants to finish, and he waited for Molly to come home from work, from this latest client meeting of hers that was already dragging on for 3 hours longer than usual, and his mind was spinning about those Instagram likes, about the whispers in the night, about the way his body betrayed him every time he tried to be closer, really closer, in that intimacy that used to be their refuge from the world, but now turned into an abyss where words drowned before they reached the other side. He hadn't wanted a fight tonight. No, he had planned a quiet evening, maybe a walk along the Elliott Bay boardwalk where they could sit on a bench and watch the ferries sailing out to the islands and talk about something light, about their plans for the fall, about the trip to Oregon they had been putting off for a year. But when the door finally opened and Molly walked in, her bag over her shoulder and her hair slightly tousled by the wind, her face so tired, but with that spark in her eyes that he had noticed more and more often after these meetings, and it lit another spark in him, jealousy, mixed with shame for his paranoia, what Dr. Mattox had called a defense mechanism, but which burned inside him like undercooked sauce, too spicy to swallow. "Harry, I'm sorry I was late," she said, kicking off her shoes at the door and walking into the living room, her steps quick and energetic, as they always were when she was returning from a successful deal, and she dropped her bag on the sofa, the same one where they watched movies on weekends, cuddling under a blanket. "This client, Logan, decided to look at another property in Bellevue, and we stopped at the cafe to discuss the details. You wouldn't believe how many nuances there are with the zoning." Her words flowed easily, charismatically, with that American directness when middle-aged people talk about work as an adventure. But Harold heard something else in them, the mention of Logan again, for the third time that week, and the name now sounded like an alarm, and he turned from the window, his face calm, but inside bubbling like soup on the stove about to boil over. "Logan again?" he asked quietly, trying not to raise his voice because that was who he was, intelligent, a little shy, a man who preferred conversation to shouting, but today the words came out with a note he couldn't hide. "You spend a lot of time with him lately. Cafes, viewings, calls. Is that normal for a realtor?" Molly paused halfway to the kitchen, her green eyes narrowing just a little, and she turned to face him, crossing her arms over her chest, her posture defensive, like a woman who senses an attack but doesn't want to escalate. "Harry, what do you mean? You're with him again. He's a client, he pays good money, and yes, we communicate because the deal is complicated. Are you jealous of the fitness trainer? That's ridiculous." But Harold wasn't laughing. He felt the paranoia he'd tried to suppress in the library, in his conversation with Bob in the Maddox session, surging through him, and he stepped closer, his hands shaking slightly, because this wasn't just a conversation, it was the beginning of something bigger, a relationship crisis where trust was fraying like old fabric. It's not funny, Molly. I see how you've changed, the jogging in those shorts every morning, the makeup you wear even for simple shows, the whispers you make into your phone at night, and his likes on your Instagram, all those hearts under your pictures. I'm not blind. You feel unfulfilled with me, don't you? Because I can't. He paused, the word impotence caught in his throat because saying it out loud felt like an admission of defeat, and he felt shame, hot and sticky, that his body, past 50, was failing him, preventing him from being the man he wanted to be for her, a young, vibrant woman who deserved passion, not this emptiness. Molly shook her head, her eyes shining with the tears she was trying to hold back, and she sat down on the couch, her shoulders slumping as if the weight of it all had suddenly come crashing down on her. Harry, you're being paranoid. Logan's a client, nothing more. And you're there, but you're not. You're like a ghost in this house. You sit in your office, you go to consultations, but when I come in, you look at me like I'm a stranger. You don't really hold me, you don't really kiss me like you used to. I feel invisible, like I'm trying and you're just there. Her words hit her like cold rain in the face, and Harold sat down opposite her, in the chair they had bought at a flea market in Portland during their honeymoon, when everything had been full of hope and laughter, and now this chair seemed too hard to him, like the reality of their marriage. A ghost, he said, his voice breaking as it echoed his own words at the urologist, and he felt the themes of self-worth and forgiveness tangled in a knot that would not be untied. Molly, I want to be with you. I want to hold you, kiss you, be close to you. But I can't. Physically. It's torture, wanting to but not being able to. Every night I lie there wondering how to explain it, how to say that I'm still the same inside, but my body is betraying me. Age, stress, all of it. I go to doctors, I try, but you go into your own world, with these clients, with Logan, and I'm afraid you'll find something there that I don't have. Tears rolled down her cheeks, and she wiped them away with the sleeve of her blouse, her voice rising, with the emotion that was her custom when she felt an injustice. Do you think this is easy for me? I love you, Harry, but I feel alone. You don't talk about me as a woman, you talk about problems. And I want to feel desired, visible, not an invisible shadow in your life. And yes, Logan flirts sometimes, but I do nothing because I respect us. But if you continue to suspect, you yourself will ruin everything. Harold stood up, went to her, wanted to hug, but she pulled away slightly, and this movement cut to the heart, emphasizing their emotional distance, and he said, I'm an unsuspecting monster, Molly. I'm just a man who is afraid of losing you. Because without you, I really will become a ghost. Let's try, go with me to Mattox, talk together. This is not only my problem, it's ours. She nodded, but the tears didn't stop, and they sat like that for a while, in the silence of the living room, where the clock on the wall ticked, a reminder of time passing and of family responsibilities that required effort from both of them, not just one. Then Molly stood up, went into the kitchen, poured herself a water, and said over her shoulder, Okay, Harry, I'll come with you. But stop stalking me on social media. It's humiliating. He didn't deny checking Instagram because the shame was too great, and instead suggested, Let's go away for the weekend. To that cabin in the mountains you love. No phones, no work, just us. She turned, her eyes red but hopeful. Maybe, but right now, I need to be alone. With these words, she went upstairs to the bedroom, and Harold remained in the living room, feeling how the quarrel had left behind an emptiness, like after a storm when the wind has died down, but the destruction is visible. Later that evening, they drove to a small Italian restaurant in Capitol Hill that Harold knew from his days as a chef, where the chef, an old Italian named Mario, always kept a table for him by the window overlooking a busy street full of young couples and buskers, and they sat there with pasta and wine, hoping the change of scenery would ease the tension. but the air between them was as heavy as the cigarette smoke on the patio outside. "Harry, I'm sorry about the ghost," Molly said, twirling her glass in her hands, her voice softer now, a note of regret. "I didn't mean to hurt you. It's just ... it quote S been building up. I see you in pain, and it hurts. Tell me what it's like to want to and not be able to. I'm trying to understand." He looked at her, her face in the warm lamplight, and tried to explain, the words coming out slowly, like syrup from a bottle. "It's like being hungry, but not being able to eat. You can see the food, you can smell it, but your body says no. And it's not just physical, Molly. It's a blow to your self-worth. I think, who am I now? A husband, a friend, or just a roommate? And you're so alive, and I'm afraid you'll go looking for what I'm not giving." She reached across the table, squeezed his fingers. "I won't go, but we need to work on it. Intimacy isn't just sex, it's closeness. Let's try baby steps. Cuddling, talking." They talked about moral dilemmas, how age changes roles in marriage, and about forgiveness that begins with oneself, and the evening ended on a positive note, with a kiss in the parking lot. But in the car on the way home, the silence returned like an old guest. That night, in their bedroom, the curtains fluttering in the light breeze from the open window, they lay down in bed, not in each other's arms as before, but with their backs to each other, each in his own world, Harold thinking of the session at Maddox tomorrow, where he would talk about this fight, and Molly perhaps about Logan or her frustration, and the camera, if this were a movie, would slowly pan up to show the two people in the same big bed, under the same blanket, but separated by an invisible wall in different worlds, where words were left unspoken and wounds were open, and the house around them seemed vast and empty, like an ocean in which they floated parallel, but not together. The next day, Harold drove to Mattox's office, an old building downtown overlooking the Sound where the waves crashed against the pier, and the session began with him telling the story of the argument. "She called me a ghost, doctor. And that's true I am, but I am not." Mattox, with his irony, chuckled. "Harold, ghosts are those who do not live. You are alive, just in a pause. Tell her your fears without accusations, and let her tell you hers. That is the path to forgiveness." Harold nodded, but inside he was thinking about the detective story, the idea for which was still simmering, and after the session he stopped at a bookstore in the University District and bought a book on the psychology of relationships, hoping to find answers in the words of strangers. That evening they met in the kitchen, cooking a salad and a steak together, and Molly said, "Harry, let's go to the cabin. Let's try to start over." But there was a shadow in her eyes, and he wondered if Logan had called today. The trip to the cabin in the Cascade Mountains was impromptu. They packed up in an hour, drove down the highway where the trees closed in on the road, and in the cabin, with a fireplace and a view of the forest, they tried to get close. They walked the trails, talked about childhood, about dreams, but when it was time for intimacy, Harold pulled away again, and Molly cried softly, "I feel invisible, Harry." He put his arms around her, but the words wouldn't come, and they returned to the city, the baggage of the unspoken heavier. At the end of the week, while meeting friends at a bar in Belltown where there was live music, Harold saw Molly laugh at a friend's joke and felt jealousy again, but he suppressed it, thinking about personal growth. At home, they lay back to back, and the camera panned upward, emphasizing their loneliness as a couple. Harold pushed open the glass door to Dr. Grayson Mattox's office and was greeted by a familiar smell, a mix of freshly brewed coffee from the coffee shop downstairs and a hint of lavender from the diffuser on the receptionist's desk, which Mattox had once joked was supposed to calm clients while they wait to unload their problems on me. The office was on the sixth floor of an old building in downtown Seattle, overlooking Puget Sound, where on this day gray waves lapped lazily against the pier and distant ferries left white marks like scars on the water. It was Harold's third visit this month, and each visit had been a journey into the depths of his soul, where he, the intelligent, reserved former chef, felt at once vulnerable and strangely alive, as if the words he found here, in this office with its worn leather chair and its bookcase full of Freud and Jung, were giving back pieces of himself that he had lost through marriage and age. Today he had come with a heavy heart after his fight with Molly, after her talk of a ghost, and their night in the cabin with their backs to each other. He had taken a step he had told no one. He had hired a private detective, a man named Roy Sullivan, whose office in Pioneer Square smelled of leather and cigarettes, and whose voice on the phone was gruff but confident, promising results within a week. Harold felt ashamed of what he had done, but the paranoia fueled by Logan's Instagram likes and Molly's late-night whispers had gotten the better of him, and now he sat in front of Mattox, trying to figure out if he had broken the trust in their marriage for good. Mattox, a man of 50 with graying temples and eyes that always had a glimmer of irony, leaned back in his chair, resting his notebook on his knee, and said with a slight smile, "Well, Harold, you look as if you've just signed a contract with the devil. What's the matter? Molly again? Or are you still at war with yourself?" His voice was deep, with that American directness that can be both friendly and insightful, as if he already knew the answer, but wanted Harold to figure it out for himself. Harold sighed, his fingers fiddling nervously with the hem of his jacket, and he looked out the window where a seagull had flown across the water, leaving only a shadow in its wake. "I don't know where to begin, Doctor. After our fight, she called me a ghost, and I can't get it out of my head. She's right, I am, but I'm not. I can't be with her the way I used to be, and it's killing me. And I did something I regret, but it's too late." He paused, feeling the words stick in his throat, but Mattox didn't push him, just nodded, his eyes attentive, but not judgmental, and that gave Harold the courage to continue. "I hired a detective to keep an eye on Molly. I know it sounds awful, but I can't stop thinking about Logan, that trainer. She says he's just a client, but I can see the way she smiles when his name comes up, the way she checks her phone, the way she goes for runs in those damn shorts. I'm going crazy, Doctor. This isn't me, this isn't the person I was, but I don't know how to stop." Mattox put down his notebook, crossed his arms, and looked at Harold with that mixture of sympathy and irony that made him such an effective therapist. "Harold, let me be as blunt as an American who orders a burger without asking questions. You haven't lost your manhood. You've lost your confidence. Those are two different things, and you're confusing them because age and physical change hit your ego like a hammer on glass. But manhood isn't just about sex or what happens in the bedroom. It's about how you stand on your own 2 feet, how you look at the world, how you tell the truth to yourself and to others. And right now you're hiding behind paranoia because you're afraid of the truth. Detective, that's not the answer. That's running. You don't trust Molly, but more importantly, you don't trust yourself." His words were like a sting, sharp but accurate, and Harold felt the shame he had been carrying with him since the call to Sullivan grew heavier, like the sack of flour he was lugging around on his shoulders. "But what if she—" Harold began, his voice shaking. "What if she really is with him? I can see how different she is. She doesn't sleep in her pajamas, she puts on lipstick before work, she whispers at night. This isn't paranoia, Doctor, these are facts. I don't want to be that husband who turns a blind eye while his wife—" He didn't finish because the word cheating was too hard to say out loud, but Maddox understood and leaned a little closer, his eyes narrowing like a man who can see through smoke. "Harold, facts aren't likes on Instagram or whispers in the bathroom. Facts are things you know for sure, not things your imagination paints. You hired a detective because you're afraid to ask her directly. Why? Because you're afraid of the answer? Or because you're afraid she'll see you as weak? Tell me what scares you most." Harold thought for a moment, looking down at his hands, where his wedding ring gleamed dully in the lamplight. He remembered their drive to the cabin, Molly crying, saying she felt invisible, and how he couldn't find the words to explain his pain, his inability to be the man she deserved. "I'm afraid she'll leave," he said quietly, almost a whisper. "I love her, Doctor. She's my light, my life. But I see her drifting away, and I don't know if it's because of me or someone else. I can't be the man I used to be, passionate, confident. Impotence, it's like a stigma. I go to the urologist, I think about Viagra, but it doesn't solve the main thing. I don't feel like a man. And if she's with Logan, then that's proof that I've failed, that I'm not good enough. And if I ask, and she tells the truth, I don't know if I can bear it." Mattox nodded, his irony turning to warmth, as if he saw Harold not just as a client, but as a man on the brink of an abyss. "Harold, look, you haven't lost your manhood, because manhood isn't about an erection or age. It's about honesty, about the courage to be vulnerable. You're hiding behind the detective right now because you're afraid to be vulnerable with Molly. But here's my advice, and I say this as someone who's seen hundreds of marriages fall apart over unsaid things. Don't stalk her. Teach yourself. Start by rebuilding your confidence not in bed, but in who you are. You're a chef, a man who's created dishes that have made people cry with joy. You're a loving husband who's willing to fight for your marriage. Start with small steps, inviting her out on a date like you did the first year, talking about your fears without making accusations, and call that detective off before it's too late. Because if she finds out, the trust you're trying to save will crumble to dust. Harold felt Mattox's words settle in him like salt in a marinade, slowly but deeply, and he nodded, although he was torn between calling Sullivan and calling it off or waiting for his report, which promised hard facts by the end of the week. "I'll try, doctor," he said, standing up. "But it's hard. I want to believe her, but every time she picks up the phone, I see Logan in my head. It's like poison." Mattox chuckled. "The poison is your insecurity, Harold. Drink the antidote, start with yourself, and come back in a week and tell me how the date went." Harold walked out of his office, took the elevator down, and found himself outside, where the air was crisp from the morning rain, and the smell of wet pavement mingled with the aroma of hot dogs from a nearby food truck. He decided to walk to the parking lot to clear his head, and stopped in a small bookstore on First Avenue, where the shelves were stacked with books on psychology and self-help, hoping to find something that would help him recapture that confidence Mattox had talked about. He bought a book called Manhood in the Modern World, with the subtitle How to Be Strong in a Time of Change, and leafed through it as he sat in the cafe across the street, which served strong espresso and croissants that he would have rated a solid 8 on his old restaurant scale. As he read, he came across a phrase: "Manhood is not about strength in the body, it's about strength in the mind. It's about choosing to be true to yourself." And it made him think about the moral dilemmas, about how hiring a detective was not just an act of mistrust towards Molly, but also a betrayal of himself, a man who had always prided himself on his calmness and honesty. When he got home, he found Molly in the garden, watering her roses, her hair in a messy bun, wearing an old t-shirt he'd given her for their first anniversary that said Seattle Food Festival, and it made him smile because it reminded him of when they were closer. "Hey, Molly," he said, coming over and sitting on the bench next to her. "I was at Maddox's today. He said it wasn't my manhood that I'd lost. It was my confidence, and I want to try to get it back. Maybe we can go to that jazz club on Columbia Street tomorrow." Like old times, she turned, her eyes soft but with a hint of weariness from their fight. "Harry, that sounds great. I want us to try. But will you stop suspecting me? It hurts." He nodded, fighting the urge to tell the detective, but he decided to keep quiet because Mattox was right. Trust started with him. "I'll try," he said. "Just give me time." That night, lying in bed, he stared at the ceiling, where the shadows from the streetlight danced like ghosts, and thought about what Mattox had said: "Watch yourself." He decided he would call Sullivan in the morning and call off the surveillance, but when Molly turned over in her sleep, her hand was on his chest, and he felt warmth mixed with anxiety because the phone on her nightstand had beeped a text at 1 in the morning, and he hadn't looked, but Logan's name had flashed in his head like a neon sign. He closed his eyes, trying to focus on himself, on his certainty, but paranoia whispered, "What if the detective has already found something?" The next day, before going out to the jazz club, Harold stopped at a waterfront coffee shop where he sometimes worked on restaurant stories and called Sullivan. "Mr. Beckett, I've started," he said gruffly. "Give me a couple of days and I'll report back." Harold hesitated, Mattox's words echoing in his head, but he said, "Okay, but don't call me until I get in touch." He hung up, shame and hope warring inside him, and drove home to pick up Molly, resolving that today he would be the man who chose love over fear. That night at a jazz club where the saxophone flowed like wine, they sat at a table near the stage and Molly laughed at a joke he made about mixing up salt and sugar at a restaurant, and for a second it was like before their eyes met and he felt a spark. But when she pulled out her phone to take a photo, he saw a notification from Logan and his heart sank. He decided not to ask, but instead took her hand and said, "Molly, I want to be better. For us." She smiled, but there was a shadow in her eyes, and Harold knew that the road to forgiveness and trust would be long, but he was willing to take it, or at least start. Harold sat in his Toyota, parked on a quiet street in the Fremont neighborhood, where the streetlights cast a soft yellow light on the wet pavement and the air smelled of rain and freshly cut grass from the nearby park, his fingers clutching the envelope that Roy Sullivan, the private detective, had handed him an hour earlier at the corner diner, as if he were handing him the bill for dinner and not a bomb that would blow his life to pieces. The envelope was heavy, not from the paper, but from what was inside photographs that, in Sullivan's words, speak for themselves, and Harold hesitated to open it because he knew that once he did, there would be no turning back, like that moment when you add too much salt to a sauce and realize the dish is ruined. He looked at his wedding ring, gleaming dully in the dim light of the salon, and thought of how Molly had put it on his finger 6 years ago, laughing, her eyes full of love, and now he felt like a little boy who hadn't been picked for the school team, standing on the sidelines while the others ran off to play. His inner voice, quiet and tired, whispered, "I didn't think I'd feel like a little boy who wasn't chosen again at this age. I thought life would get easier after 50, but it just hits harder." The meeting with Sullivan took place in a small cafe called the Fremont Brew, where they served strong espresso and homemade blueberry pie, which Harold automatically ordered but did not eat because his appetite had vanished as soon as the detective, a man in his 40s with a rough face and eyes that had seen too much, placed the envelope on the table. "Beckett," Sullivan said, sipping coffee from a paper cup, "I did as you asked. I followed your wife for 3 days. Here's everything you need to know. If you want the details, I can give you some, but the pictures speak louder." His voice was businesslike, with that American directness that leaves no room for sentimentality, and Harold nodded, feeling shame and paranoia warring inside him, like two cooks in the same kitchen arguing over a recipe. He didn't ask anything, just took the envelope, paid in cash as agreed, and left, feeling like a traitor not only to Molly, but to himself, a man who had once prided himself on his trust in people. Now, in the car, he looked at the envelope in his lap and thought about Dr. Mattox, about his words, "Watch yourself, not her." But it was too late. He'd already taken the step the therapist had warned him about, and now the envelope was like a knife he'd held over their marriage. He sighed, opened the glove compartment, pulled out the small flashlight he kept there in case of breakage, and turned it on, shining the light on the envelope. His fingers shook as he ripped open the edge and pulled out the photographs black and white, crisp as stills from an old film noir, but with color annotations where Sullivan had noted dates and places. The first, Molly and Logan leaving a gym in downtown Seattle, his arm around her waist, her smile bright as a woman who feels desired. The second, them getting into Logan's car, an SUV with tinted windows, their silhouettes locked in an embrace too close for just a client. 3. A restaurant in downtown, cozy and dimly lit, where they sit at a table by the window and Logan touches her arm and she doesn't pull away. Last, the entrance to the Edgewater Inn, where they walk side by side, her bag slung over her shoulder and his arm around her back, the door closing behind them like a curtain. Harold looked at the photographs, his heart beating slowly, as if it didn't want to accept what his eyes were seeing. He felt as if he were back in the school gymnasium, where the boys were choosing basketball teams, and he, skinny and shy, stood last, hearing the giggles. "Beckett, you're back on the bench." He had learned to hide his pain behind a smile then, but now, at 56, he couldn't smile. His inner monologue continued, "I thought we were building something real. 6 years of coffee in the morning, roses in the garden, her laugh when I made pasta. And now what? She chose him. The boy from the gym, with muscles and energy I don't have. I don't blame her. Who am I to blame her? A man who can't be a man. But it hurts. Damn it, it hurts. He put the photographs back in the envelope, turned off the flashlight, and sat back, looking out onto the street where a couple of young men were walking arm in arm, laughing under an umbrella. He remembered how he and Molly had walked like this when they had first started dating, and she had teased him for always ordering the same wine, a Pinot Noir, because it was the safe choice. And he had replied that the safe choice was him, Harold Beckett, a man who didn't take risks without a reason. But now the risk had come in the form of these photographs, and he didn't know what to do. Confrontation, divorce, or just silence, as he had all these months when he had felt their marriage cracking like an old ceramic cup. The themes of trust and self-worth that Mattox had talked about now seemed as distant as the stars behind the clouds, and the moral dilemma of blaming Molly or forgiving was tearing at him like a knife lodged in his chest. He started the car and drove home, not straight ahead, but along the waterfront, where the ferries hooted in the dark and the lights of the city reflected in the water like shards of his hopes. He stopped at a small pier where he sometimes fished with his friend Bob and got out, holding the envelope in his hand as if it were a grenade. He thought about throwing it into the water, as if that would erase the truth. But instead he sat on a bench, looking out over the bay, and let himself cry, quietly, without sobbing, like a man who was used to holding everything inside. I never thought I'd be crying over a woman at 56, he thought. But I'm not crying over her. I'm crying over me because I don't know who I am without her. A chef, a consultant, a husband, or just an old man watching life pass him by. When he got home, he found Molly sitting on the living room couch, leafing through a real estate magazine, a blanket draped over her legs and her hair down, looking so at home, so familiar, that for a second he doubted the photographs. "Harry, you're late," she said, looking up and smiling, but there was a tiredness in her smile, as if she, too, were carrying a burden. "Everything okay? You look, I don't know, lost." He nodded, clutching the envelope in his jacket pocket, and said, "Long day. I stopped by to see a friend." "How was your day?" She shrugged, her voice light but tense. "The usual." Showed me an office in Bellevue. Logan, that coach, was being picky again, but we seemed to have a deal. Logan's name cut like a blade, and Harold felt his fingers tighten around the envelope, but he forced himself to smile. "Cool. I'll make dinner. Want some risotto?" She nodded, her eyes returning to the magazine, and he went into the kitchen where he began chopping onions, feeling tears flowing not only from him, but from the pain that was building up inside him. In the kitchen, amid the familiar sounds of sizzling butter and ticking clocks, he thought about his familial duties. Being a husband meant not just loving but making decisions, and he didn't know what the right decision was. Should he show her the photographs, ask her directly, or follow Mattox's advice and work on himself, on his confidence, even when it seemed impossible? He remembered their trip to the cabin, how she had cried, saying she felt invisible, and now he felt invisible, like a boy no one noticed. "Maybe I was always like this," he thought, stirring the risotto. "Maybe she chose me because I was safe, and now she wants someone else, someone alive, like Logan." Dinner was quiet. They ate at the table, talked about small things, the weather, the new restaurant that had opened downtown, but the envelope lay in his jacket, hanging over a chair, like a shadow that would not disappear even in the light. Later, in the bedroom, Molly went to bed first, and Harold stood by the window, looking out at the garden where her roses swayed in the wind, and thought about forgiveness. Could he forgive if the truth were confirmed? And could he forgive himself for going to the detective? He lay down next to her, but did not touch her, and the camera, if this had been a film, would have gone up again, showing two people separated not only by the blanket, but by the truth that one knew and the other hid. The next day, Harold drove to a small park near Lake Union where he sometimes walked to think, and sat on a bench holding the envelope. He decided to call Mattox and make an appointment to talk about the photos, about his shame, about how he felt like the boy who hadn't been chosen. But when he pulled out his phone, a text came from Sullivan. "More photos. Tomorrow at the cafe. Want some?" Harold stared at the screen, and his fingers froze. He wanted to say no, but instead he wrote yes, and in that moment, he realized that the trust he had wanted to save was already cracked, like the cup he had accidentally broken when they were first married. Harold sat in his old Toyota, parked on a narrow street in the Fremont neighborhood, where the streetlights cast yellowish spots of light on the wet asphalt, and the air smelled of rain mixed with the scent of freshly cut grass from the nearby park, and his fingers clutched nervously at the envelope that Roy Sullivan, the private detective, had handed him an hour ago at the corner cafe, as if he were handing him a bill for coffee and not dynamite that would blow his life to pieces. The envelope was plain, brown, with a thin red stripe along the edge, but its weight was felt not in the grams of paper, but in what lay inside, photographs that, in Sullivan's words, leave no questions, and Harold did not dare open it because he knew that once he did, the world he had spent 6 years building with Molly would crack like glass under a hammer blow, and there would be no turning back, like the moment when you overcook a salmon and it becomes dry and irretrievably spoiled. He looked at his wedding ring, gleaming dully in the dimness of the salon, and his inner voice, tired but clear, sounded like a whisper in an empty room. I didn't think I'd be this old again, feeling like a little boy who wasn't chosen. At 56, I thought life would be quieter, like wine that had been aged to perfection, but instead it hits me like a knife in the back, and I'm standing here with this envelope, like a fool who dug his own hole. The meeting with Sullivan took place in the Fremont Brew, a small place with wooden tables and the smell of blueberry pie in the air, reminding Harold of the days when he baked his own desserts in a restaurant where every bite was art, not just food. He ordered the pie mechanically, but did not touch it, his appetite gone as Sullivan, a man of about 40 with a rough face, a scar on his cheek, and eyes that had seen too many secrets, placed the envelope on the table. "Mr. Beckett," he said, sipping coffee from a paper cup, his voice husky, with that businesslike intonation that Americans use when they want to show that work is just work, without unnecessary emotion. "I did what you asked. 3 days of surveillance. Here is everything you need to know. If you want, I can give you the details, but the pictures speak for themselves." Harold nodded, feeling the shame of his decision to hire a detective mingled with the paranoia that was growing inside him like mold on a forgotten loaf of bread. He didn't ask any questions, just took the envelope, stuffed it in his jacket pocket, paid cash $200 as agreed and walked out, feeling not just like a traitor to Molly, but like a traitor to himself, the Harold Beckett who had once believed in honesty and trust as the essential ingredients of a good marriage. Now he sat in his car, parked at the park where children had once played soccer, now with only the occasional jogger flashing in the streetlights at an hour of darkness, and his fingers shook as he held the envelope like it was a ticking time bomb. He turned on the small flashlight he kept in the glove compartment in case of breakdowns and shined the light on the envelope, tearing at the edge as if he were slicing open his own heart. Inside were photographs, black and white, crisply detailed, like stills from an old detective movie, but annotated in color where Sullivan had carefully written dates and places in pen. The first, Molly and Logan leaving a gym in downtown Seattle, his arm around her waist, and she smiling, not the professional smile of a realtor, but the bright, open smile of a woman who feels alive, wanted. 2. Getting into his SUV, black with tinted windows, and their silhouettes locked in an embrace that lasted too long, too close for just a customer. 3. A restaurant downtown, cozy and candlelit, where they sat at a table by the window, and Logan touched her hand, and she didn't pull away, her eyes shining like she was listening to something important. Last, the entrance to the Edgewater Inn, where the Puget Sound crashed against the boardwalk, and they walked side by side, his arm on her back, her bag slung over her shoulder, the door closing behind them like a curtain at a theater where a tragedy was being performed. Harold looked at the photographs, his heart beating slowly, like a metronome counting down the end of something important. He felt as if he were back in the high school gym in his hometown in Iowa, where the boys were choosing basketball teams, and he, skinny and shy, with glasses that slid down his nose, stood last, hearing the whispers. "Beckett, you're back on the bench." He had learned to hide his pain behind a smile, to retreat into his books or into the kitchen, where he could at least control the taste of his soup. But now, at 56, he could not smile. His inner monologue continued, like the bitter taste of unfinished coffee. I thought we were building something real. 6 years morning coffee, her roses in the garden, her laugh when I spilled sauce on my shirt. I thought she chose me, despite my age, despite everything. And now she's chosen him, the boy from the gym, with the muscles, with the energy, with what I can't give her. I don't blame her, how can I? I'm a man who can't be a man. But damn, it hurts, like someone ripped a piece of me out and walked away without looking back. He put the photographs back in the envelope, turned off the flashlight, and sat back, looking out at the street where a young couple walked arm in arm, laughing under an umbrella, their silhouettes blurred by the streetlight, and he remembered how he and Molly had walked like this along the Elliott Bay boardwalk in the first months of their marriage, when she had teased him about always ordering Pinot Noir because it was the safe choice, and he had replied that the safe choice was himself, Harold Beckett, a man who took no risks without a reason, who built his life like a dish, carefully, lovingly, step by step. But now the risk had come in the form of these photographs, and he didn't know what to do: burn them, show them to her, ask her directly, or keep quiet, as he had kept quiet all these months, watching their marriage crack like the old ceramic cup he had broken by accident when they were first married, and Molly had laughed and said, "Harry, it's good luck, don't worry." Now he doubted whether that happiness had been real. He started the car and drove, not to his home, but to the waterfront, where the ferries hooted in the dark and the lights of Seattle reflected in the bay like shards of his hopes. He stopped at a small pier where he sometimes fished with Bob, an old friend from the restaurant business, and got out, holding the envelope in his hand, as if it were a grenade with the pin pulled. The wind off the bay was cold and smelled of salt and iodine, and Harold thought about throwing the envelope in the water, as if that would erase the truth, wash it away like a stain on a white tablecloth. But instead he sat down on a bench, wet from a recent rain, and let himself cry, quietly, without sobbing, like a man who is used to keeping everything inside, because in American culture men over 50 don't cry, they solve problems. But he didn't know how to solve this one. I'm not crying for her, he thought, wiping his eyes with his sleeve. I'm crying for myself. Because I don't know who I am without her. A chef, a consultant, a husband, or just an old man watching life pass him by, like a ferry sailing away, leaving you behind. He remembered Dr. Maddox's words from their last session. You haven't lost your masculinity, you've lost your confidence. But now, with the pictures, confidence seemed like a mirage, like an oasis in the desert that vanished the closer you got. He thought about trust, how it crumbled at the mere sight of the truth, and about self-worth, slipping through his fingers like sand, because if Molly had chosen Logan, what did that say about him, Harold? He remembered their trip to the cabin in the Cascades, how she had cried, saying she felt invisible, and now he felt invisible, like the kid in the audience who no one noticed while the others played. He pulled out his phone, wanted to call Maddox, but instead texted Bob, "Can you meet tomorrow? I need to talk." Bob responded a minute later, "Sure, man. Something serious? Meet me at Pike's for lunch." Harold texted, "Yeah, serious. Thanks." When he got home, he walked quietly into the house so as not to wake Molly if she was already asleep, but he found her in the living room, sitting on the couch under a blanket, leafing through a real estate magazine, her hair down and wearing the Seattle Food Festival t-shirt he'd given her for their first anniversary, which had sent a pang through him because she looked so familiar, so close, that for a second he questioned the photographs, as if they might be a mistake, a fake, a trick of the light. "Harry, you're late," she said, looking up and smiling, but there was a tiredness in her smile, as if she, too, was carrying some burden she didn't want to show. "Is everything okay? You look, I don't know, lost." He nodded, clutching the envelope in his jacket pocket, which he'd hung on the coat rack by the door, and said, trying to keep his voice even, "Long day. I was visiting a friend. How's your day?" She shrugged, her voice light, but with a hint of tension, as if she could sense his mood. "The usual, showing around the office in Bellevue. Logan, that trainer, was being picky again, but we seem to have a deal. There's another show tomorrow, so I'll probably be late again." Logan's name cut like a blade, and Harold felt his fingers tighten around an imaginary envelope, even though he'd left it in his jacket. He forced himself to smile, but it came out tight, like dough that hadn't been rolled out well enough. "Cool, I'll make dinner. Want some risotto?" he asked, going into the kitchen to keep his hands busy, to keep himself from breaking down, to ask, "Were you with him at the hotel, Molly? Did you hug him in the car?" She nodded, turning back to the magazine, and said, "That sounds great, Harry. You're the best." But the words, which had once been warming, now sounded empty, like a compliment from a stranger. In the kitchen, amid the familiar sounds of sizzling butter and the ticking of the clock on the wall, Harold chopped onions, carrots, and celery, preparing the base for a risotto, and thought about his family duties. Being a husband meant not only loving but making decisions, even when they broke his heart. Should he show her the photographs, ask her directly, or keep quiet, as he had kept quiet all these months, watching their marriage crack like the cup he had broken, and Molly had said it was good luck? He remembered their fight, when she had called him a ghost, and now he felt like that, a shadow that walked around the house but did not truly live there. Maybe I was always like this, he thought, stirring the rice in the pan. Maybe she chose me because I was safe, reliable, like an old recipe that always works. And now she wants someone else, someone alive like Logan, the boy in the audience who isn't afraid to take risks. Dinner was quiet, at the dining room table overlooking the garden where Molly's roses swayed in the breeze, and they talked about small things. The new restaurant downtown, the weather that promised rain this weekend, how their neighbor had forgotten to empty the trash cans again. But the envelope lay in his jacket, a shadow that didn't disappear even in the candlelight Molly had lit to make the evening cozier. She smiled as she talked about the funny client who wanted an office with a view of the Space Needle, but Harold barely listened, his mind on the photographs, on the hotel, on the door that had closed behind her and Logan. After dinner, she went off to wash the dishes, and he stayed at the table, looking at his wedding ring, and thought, "I don't want to be the boy in the audience who doesn't get chosen, but I don't know how to be the man who gets chosen again." Later, in the bedroom, where the curtains blew in the night breeze and the scent of lavender from her lotion filled the air, Molly lay down first, curled up under the covers, and Harold stood at the window, looking out at the garden where the shadows of the trees danced in the moonlight. He thought about forgiveness. Could he forgive her if the truth came true? And could he forgive himself for going to the detective, for letting paranoia override trust? He lay down next to her, but did not touch her, and their backs, separated by the covers, were like two banks of a river, once connected by a bridge that had now collapsed. The camera, if this had been a film, would have panned up, showing two people in the same bed, but in different worlds, with the truth in an envelope in the next room, like a knife ready to cut their lives in half. The next day, Harold drove to Lake Union Park, where he sometimes walked to clear his head, and sat on a bench with the envelope in his pocket. The morning was clear, with few clouds, and the lake glittered in the sun like a mirror, reflecting his own face, tired and lined in ways he hadn't noticed before. He took out his phone to call Maddox, to tell him about the photos, his shame, how he felt like the boy who hadn't been chosen, but instead he saw a text from Sullivan. "Got more photos. Tomorrow at the cafe. Want some?" His fingers hovered over the screen, and he remembered Maddox's words. "Watch yourself, not her." He wanted to write no, he wanted to cancel everything, but instead he answered, "Yes." And at that moment, he realized that the trust that he wanted to save so much was already cracked, like that cup that he broke, and no, fortunately, would save it. He decided to meet Bob at Pike's Bar in Pike Place Market, where the smell of fish and flowers mingled with the noise of tourists, and sat at the bar, ordering a beer, which he rarely drank because he preferred wine, but today he needed something sharp to drown out the taste of pain. Bob came in half an hour later, his mustache twitching when he saw Harold's face. "Harry, you look like you've been run over by a truck. What happened?" "Molly." Harold nodded, finished his beer, and told him not everything, but enough. About the detective, about the photographs, about the hotel. Bob whistled. "Damn, man, this is serious. What are you going to do? Talk to her?" Harold shrugged. I don't know, Bob. If I ask her and she lies, I won't be able to stand it. And if she tells the truth, I probably won't be able to stand it either. Bob clapped him on the shoulder. You're stronger than you think. But don't keep it inside. Talk, or let it go. But don't sit there with that envelope like a bomb. That evening, Harold returned home to find Molly humming under her breath as she prepared a salad, and her energy, her charisma, which had once lit a spark in him, now seemed alien. He looked at her hands cutting cucumbers, and thought, how could you, Molly? But how could I get to the detective? They ate, laughed at some joke, but his heart was somewhere in that envelope, and when they went to bed, back to back, he heard his inner voice again. The boy in the audience who wasn't chosen. But I'm still here, and I want to be the man she chooses again. But how? Harold sat at the kitchen table, where the light from the hanging lamp cast a warm circle on the wooden countertop, covered in fine scratches from years of shared dinners, and looked at the plate of baked salmon he had prepared with lemon and rosemary, just the way Molly liked it, but his fork lay untouched, because appetite, like so many things in their house, had become a ghost, fading away like the scent of herbs dissolving into the air. The kitchen smelled of fresh fish and the garlic from the mashed potatoes he'd whipped by hand, the way he always did when he wanted dinner to be special, and tonight it was not because of the food, but because of the decision he'd made yesterday, sitting on a bench by Lake Union with an envelope of photographs in his pocket that burned like a hot coal, but which he'd never shown to her because he'd realized that the truth he'd learned wouldn't change the past, but might define their future if he chose to talk instead of fight. Molly sat across from him, wearing a lightweight sea-green sweater, her hair pulled back into a loose bun, smiling as she talked about a new client who wanted to buy a house overlooking the bay, but her eyes, green as the moss in their garden, looked tired, as if she, too, was carrying a burden she didn't want to show. Harold looked at her fingers swirling her glass of white wine, and felt the words he had been rehearsing all day gather in his throat like dough about to rise, and he knew it was now or never. He put down his fork, cleared his throat, and said quietly, without malice, without the venom that had been building in him since he had seen the photographs from Sullivan, "Molly, I know." His voice was level, intelligent as always, but there was a new note in it, not accusatory but weary acceptance, like a man who has been through a storm and emerged on the other side, soaking wet but alive. Molly froze, her glass halfway to her lips, and she looked at him, her eyebrows slightly raised, as if she were trying to figure out what he meant. But there was a flicker of light in her eyes, not surprise but something like relief, as if she had been waiting for this moment, dreading it but knowing it was inevitable. You know what? She asked, her voice shaking, and she set the glass down on the table, her fingers trembling slightly like the leaves in the wind outside the window, where the garden was drowning in twilight. Harold sighed, looking at her, at this woman he loved more than he could say, despite the pain, despite the pictures of her hugging Logan, walking into a hotel with him, laughing in a restaurant, and he said, trying to keep his voice soft, as if he were talking to a child he didn't want to scare, I know about Logan, about the gym, the car, the restaurant, about the hotel. He didn't mention the detective, not because he wanted to hide what he had done, but because it didn't matter. What mattered was what lay between them, like the crack in the foundation of their house that they both saw but pretended wasn't growing. Molly went pale, her eyes filled with tears, and she covered her mouth with her hand as if to stop the words from escaping. But then she dropped her hand and began to cry, quietly, without sobbing, like someone who had held everything inside for too long. Harry, I didn't mean to, she whispered, her voice breaking like glass. I didn't want it to be like this. I wasn't looking for it. It's just, I felt like I was dying inside. Like I was invisible, like I wasn't a woman anymore, just a realtor, a friend, a neighbor. I don't know how to explain it. Her words cut him because they echoed his own thoughts, how he had felt like a ghost, like the boy in the audience who had not been chosen, and he realized that their pain was mirrored, like two people looking out the same window but seeing different views. He reached across the table and touched her fingers, cold with shock, and said, Molly, I'm not leaving you, but I'm leaving this silence. We've been silent for too long, me about my fears, you about yours. We need to talk, to hear each other, and decide together or alone. His voice was firm but not hard, because he didn't want war, he wanted the truth, even if it broke his heart, because only the truth would give them a chance, if there was one. Molly looked at him, tears streaming down her cheeks, leaving streaks on his sweater, and she squeezed his hand as if she were afraid he would disappear. Harry, I didn't mean to hurt you. Logan, it was a mistake. He was, he saw me, told me I was beautiful, that I was alive. And with you, you stopped looking at me like that. You looked at me like I was already gone. And I didn't know how to tell you that it hurt, that I felt alone, even when you were here. She paused, wiped her eyes with her sleeve, and went on, her voice a little louder, with the charisma that always made her so alive. I didn't sleep with him, if that's what you think. There were moments, yeah, hugs, conversations, but I stopped. Because I love you, Harry. But I don't know how to be with you when you're not here, even when you're sitting across from me. Harold nodded, feeling her words, a mixture of recognition and pain, settle into him like salt in a marinade, slowly but deeply. He remembered what Dr. Mattox had said about manhood, not being about the body, but about the courage to be vulnerable, and he was vulnerable now more than ever, but there was power in that vulnerability, because he wasn't yelling, not accusing, but talking. Molly, I feel alone too, he said, looking into her eyes where tears mingled with hope. I can't be the man I used to be, physically. It's age, it's shit, it's torture to want you and not be able to. And I was afraid you'd leave because I wasn't giving you what you deserved. But I won't keep quiet any longer. If we're going to be together, we need to talk about the pain, about the desires, about the things we're afraid of. I'm ready. Are you? She nodded, her fingers tightening on his arm, and she said, I'm ready, Harry, but I'm scared. I don't want to lose you, but I don't know how to get back to what was. He smiled weakly, feeling for the first time in weeks that this conversation, this moment of honesty, was the first step on a path that might lead to reconciliation or separation, but most importantly, it was a step forward. We can't get back to what was, he said, but maybe we can build something new. If we want, let's try it with Mattox together, or on our own, but without the silence. They sat there for a long time, holding hands, the food growing cold on the table like old habits that no longer worked. Molly stood up, came to him, hugged him from behind, her cheek pressed to the top of his head, and whispered, I'm sorry, Harry. I didn't mean to be the one to hurt. He turned, hugged her, feeling the warmth of her body, and said, and you forgive me for being a ghost. Let's start over. After dinner, they went out onto the patio, where the evening air was cool and the stars were breaking through the clouds, and sat on the swing they had bought at a garage sale last year, when they were still dreaming of the future. They talked not about Logan, not about the photos, but about small things. How Molly wanted to plant more roses, how Harold dreamed of opening a cooking class for local children, how they could go to Italy to try real tiramisu. It wasn't the end of the pain, but it was the beginning of a conversation, and Harold felt the themes of trust and forgiveness and self-worth that Mattox had talked about begin to sprout, like seeds that had been waiting for water. The next day he drove to a coffee shop on the waterfront where the waves crashed against the pier and called Sullivan to cancel the surveillance. I don't want to know any more, he said, his voice as firm as ever. It's my business, not yours. Sullivan chuckled. Whatever you say, Mr. Beckett. Good luck. Harold hung up and went for a walk along the waterfront, where the smell of salt and the cries of seagulls reminded him of the life that still lay ahead. That evening, he booked a session with Mattox to talk about the conversation, about how he had chosen not to fight, but to tell the truth, and how that had been scary but liberating. Molly agreed to go with him, and they agreed to start small with talking, with hugging, with honesty. That night, they lay in bed, not back to back, but facing each other, and the camera, if this were a movie, would pan up to show two people who were still worlds apart, but now holding hands like a life preserver, ready to sail together through the storm. Harold stood on a mat in a small physical therapy studio in the Ballard neighborhood, where the rubber smell of the machines mingled with the faint aroma of eucalyptus oil that the therapist, a woman named Claire, in her 40s with a short haircut and a voice full of cheerful American confidence, was using to massage him. The studio was cozy, with large windows overlooking a street where people hurried under umbrellas, and through the glass he could see the wet sidewalks and the signs of local bakeries. Claire, wearing a sweatshirt and holding a clipboard, was showing him exercises for his back, simple stretches that were supposed to restore his sense of body, not for the sake of potency, as he had explained to her at their first session, but to feel alive again, so that his arms and legs and shoulders would no longer feel like alien objects, like kitchen tools he hadn't picked up in a long time. "Harold," Claire said, adjusting his posture as he reached for the ceiling, "you're holding tension in your shoulders, like you're carrying a backpack full of bricks. Take a deep breath, let go. Your body wants to work with you, not against you." He nodded, feeling his muscles protest, but there was something alive in that protest, as if the body he blamed for betraying him after 50 was beginning to speak to him again, slowly but surely, like an old friend returning after a long row. He began seeing Claire twice a week, not because he was hoping for a miracle, but because Dr. Maddox's words about regaining his confidence through self-care stuck in his head like a melody he couldn't stop humming. After his sessions, he began walking more, not just to run errands, but to walk around Green Lake Park, where ducks glided across the water and runners in brightly colored sneakers passed him. And he didn't feel older than them, just different, like someone learning to feel the ground under his feet again. He would stop at wooden benches and watch the clouds reflect off the lake, and think about how the changes of age that he had thought of as an end were perhaps just a new beginning, not flashy, like Molly's, but quiet, like the morning coffee he now brewed for himself, enjoying the process rather than just the result. These walks became a ritual, as was his return to cooking, not for restaurants, not for clients, but for himself. He began experimenting at home in their kitchen, where the light from the window fell on the old wooden table, covered with knife marks from years of shared dinners. He baked bread with rosemary, kneading dough with his hands, feeling the flour cling to his fingers, and it was like meditation, like talking to himself, where he was neither a ghost nor the boy from the audience, but simply Harold Beckett, a man who could still create. One night, standing at the stove, stirring the bechamel sauce for the lasagna, he thought of Molly, not Logan, not the pictures he'd never shown her, but herself, her laughter, the way she'd danced to the radio when they were first married, and how their dinner conversation, when he'd said, "I know," had been a turning point, not the end, but the beginning of something fragile but alive. They'd started talking more, not just about pain, but about the little things. How she wanted to change the curtains in the living room. How he'd dreamed of going to New Orleans to try real gumbo. They'd go to Mattock's together, and those sessions, full of awkward silences and honesty, were like scrubbing old dishes, laborious, but the results were radiant. Molly spoke of her fear of growing old with him, of being just a wife, of losing her energy, her charisma, and he listened without interrupting, feeling how her words helped him see not only her pain but his own. But the big step for Harold was getting back to himself, not the man he'd been at 30, running a restaurant kitchen like a conductor, but the man he could be at 56, with wrinkles and a body that didn't always work, but that was still his. He decided to do something special, not just for Molly, but for their future, whatever that might be. There was a small shed in their backyard that he'd once used as a storage space for old cookbooks and tools, but now he'd turned it into an office not for work, but for living. He dusted it off, painted the walls a warm cream, put up shelves for his favorite books, and installed an old stove he'd found at a flea market in Tacoma, cast iron, with worn knobs but as functional as his own body after his sessions with Claire. He installed electricity, hung the curtains Molly had chosen, and put in a small table where they could drink coffee as before, but in a new way, with the feeling that this place was theirs to share, but his gift to her. That evening, after dinner, where he served her lasagna, and she ate it with such gusto that he felt like a chef again, he took her hand and led her out into the yard, where the lanterns cast a soft light on the grass, and the air smelled of roses and approaching fall. "Molly, I want to show you something," he said, his voice calm but with a hint of excitement, like a man stepping into the unknown. This isn't just a gift, it's an invitation. He opened the barn door, turned on the light, and she gasped at the stove, the shelves, the small coffee table with two chairs, one of which held her favorite ceramic cup. He took a key from his pocket, a simple one with a small spoon charm he'd found in an antique store, and handed it to her. "This is your key," he said, looking into her eyes where the light from the lantern reflected. "You can stay. You can go. I'm not asking for love, but I'm inviting it back if you're ready." Molly took the key, her fingers shaking, and she began to cry, not like she had that night when he'd said, "I know," but quietly, smiling, like someone who sees light at the end of a tunnel. "Harry," she said, her voice soft but full of the charisma that had always made her so alive, it's beautiful. You did this for us?" He nodded, feeling his own eyes water, not with shame but with relief. "For us, and for me. I'm learning to be myself again, Molly. Not who I was, but who I can be. And I want you to be a part of it if you want." She stepped closer, hugged him, and her warmth, her scent of lavender and coffee, reminded him why he'd fought for their marriage, despite the pain, despite Logan, despite everything. "I want to," she whispered. "I want to try. But slowly, okay? We're both learning again." They stood in the barn, hugging the light from the street lamps outside, painting their silhouettes on the wall like a painting of two people, imperfect but together. Later, they drank coffee at the new table, laughing at the way the stove smoked slightly, and talking about the future, not the past, not the pain, but how they might go to Italy, how he might teach the kids to cook, how she wanted to start her own agency. It was not the end of a crisis, but the beginning of a journey where trust, forgiveness, and self-worth intertwined like the ingredients in a good dish that takes time to develop its flavor. The next day, Harold went for a walk along the trail in Discovery Park, where the pines swayed overhead and the scent of the pine reminded him of life that went on despite age. He felt his body, not young, not perfect, but his, and that was enough. That night he cooked dinner, pasta with truffle oil, for himself, for Molly, for their future, and when she came home her smile was brighter than before, as if that too was beginning to come back. They ate on the patio, under the stars, and the camera, if this had been a movie, would have panned up to show their laughter, their hands touching over the table, and the little shed in the backyard where a light burned like a beacon calling them back to each other. Harold sat on the porch of their house in Seattle, where the morning light, soft and golden, filtered through the canopy of maple trees, dappling the wood planks he had painted himself the summer before, when he had believed that remodeling the house could fix their marriage. The air was cool, with a hint of the autumn that was already breathing down his neck, and smelled of the roses that Molly had persistently watered despite the rains, because, as she said, "Roses are like us, Harry, they need attention to bloom." On the table in front of him were two ceramic cups, cracked with age, but full of freshly brewed coffee, their ritual that had returned after months of emptiness, when the cups had sat untouched, a symbol of their silence. Now the coffee was steaming, filling the air with a scent that reminded Harold of those mornings 6 years ago, when they were just starting out, when love was simpler and age was just a number. He looked at Molly across from him, in her favorite sea green sweater, her hair pulled back into a messy bun, and saw her not just as the woman who had hurt him, but as the woman he still loved, despite the photographs, despite Logan, despite the cracks they both tried to mend like old craftsmen mending china. She held the cup in both hands, her fingers curled around the ceramic, and her eyes, green as the moss in their garden, looked at him with that mixture of hope and fear that had become their new language since that conversation when he'd said, "I know." "Harry," she said quietly, her voice soft, but with that charisma that always made her so alive, even in her darkest moments, "I want to try. Really, not just talk, not just go to Mattox, but be with you, be us. I know I've done things, and I don't expect you to forget, but I want us to build something new, if you still want to." Her words hung in the air like coffee smoke, and Harold felt his heart, which had been beating in the rhythm of pain and doubt for so long, warm up, as if someone had lit a small fire in it, not bright but steady. He smiled, his smile not the wide, confident one of his youth, but soft as the light on the porch, and said, "I'm trying, Molly. First, to be me, and then to be us." This moment in the morning sun, with cups of coffee and roses in the background, was not the end of their story, but an open ending, like a book with the last page unwritten, and Harold felt it, uncertain but not empty. He remembered how it had all begun, their first meeting at a restaurant where he had made her dessert, and she had laughed at his shyness, their morning coffee, their arguments, their pain, and how he had, step by step, learned to return to himself, to his body, to his soul, to be not a ghost, but a man who could love despite his age, despite his weaknesses. His journey had not begun with Molly, but with himself, with sessions with Claire's physical therapist, where he had learned to feel his body again, with walks in Green Lake Park, where he had breathed deeply, with cooking in their kitchen where he had kneaded bread dough, as if kneading a new version of himself. And that backyard shed, which he converted into an office with a stove, became his refuge, a place where he didn't just cook, but created not just food, but hope. After that conversation, when he handed her the key to the barn, they began to move forward, slowly, like people walking on thin ice, afraid it would crack, but enjoying each step. They went to Mattock's together, and the sessions were like cleaning an old house dusty, hard, but the air was cleaner after each visit. Molly told him about her fear of losing herself, about how Logan had become a mirror in which she saw a woman and not just a realtor, and how she had stopped because she realized she wanted to be with Harold, even if it was hard. He, in turn, talked about his pain, how his impotence had made him invisible to himself, how he had been afraid she would leave, and how the photographs from the detective, which he had never shown, had become for him not proof of infidelity, but a lesson in trust. Mattox, with his irony and system, Nye listened to them, sometimes joking. "You two are like a couple who fix a car on the go hard, but possible." And they learned not to fix, but to build, step by step. Harold continued his walks, often with Molly now, along the trails of Discovery Park, where the pines whispered overhead, and they talked of the future of a trip to Italy, of the cooking class he wanted to open, of her dream of starting her own agency. He cooked for her, not to please her, but to share herself, and each time she tasted his cooking, her smile was a reward. In the evenings, they sat on the porch, drinking coffee, sometimes silent, but the silence was warm, like a blanket, not cold as before. One Saturday, they drove to a small coastal town called Port Angeles, where they walked the beach, collected shells, and ate oysters in a tiny restaurant overlooking the ocean. Molly laughed as he tried to open an oyster, his clumsiness reminding her of the way he had spilled sauce on his shirt the first time they met. "You don't change, Harry," she said, her eyes shining like the sea in the sun, "and I'm glad of it." He smiled, feeling his body, which he had learned to accept, lighten, as if age were not a burden, but an experience. But there were hard moments, too. Sometimes he would find himself thinking about Logan, about those photographs he had burned in the barn fireplace, and he would feel a pang of pain, but instead of keeping quiet, he would talk to Molly about it, and she would listen, sometimes cry, sometimes get angry, but always say, "I'm here, Harry. I choose you." And he believed her because trust, as Mattox said, begins with a choice to be honest, vulnerable, real. That morning on the porch, when she said, "I want to try," for real, he felt the ghost. He was finally coming out of the house. He didn't know what would happen next. Maybe they would build a new home together. Maybe they would go their separate ways. But he knew they were no longer silent. He took her hand, warm from the cup, and said, "We've already started, Molly, and I'm not going to stop." She smiled, and there was that sparkle in her smile that he'd fallen in love with 6 years ago. But now it was deeper, like wine that has gotten better with age. The camera, if this were a movie, would slowly pan up to show them on the porch, with cups of coffee full, a garden full of roses, and the city waking up in the distance under the gray Seattle sky. Their story is unfinished, but it is alive, like the morning light that doesn't promise a clear day, but gives warmth to go on. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one.